In the previous video, we took a look at implementing an auto NAT rule as part of a NAT policy. And then we verified that it was working, and we went to the command line of the FTD appliance to do a show NAT and show xlate to verify the translations that were in place. And in this nugget, we're going to take a look at using a manual NAT rule and place it above the auto NAT rule. So currently we have an auto NAT rule that says if traffic is going into the firewall on this interface associated with the inside zone, and if it's being routed or will be routed out this interface associated with the outside security zone, and if it's coming from the 10 network, if that's the source address, then go ahead and translate it to this IP address of .7 on the outside, which would be 23.1.2.7. Now in the NAT rules, there's three sections, 1, 2, 3. There's the manual before auto NAT, there's the auto NAT, and then there's the manual after. So I've got a question for you. If we created a new rule, and let's create a new rule just for this computer at .101. I believe that's computer 1's address. We'll verify that here in a moment. So it's 10.1.0.101. If we created a new rule that said if it's this source IP address, then we want to go ahead and translate it to 23.1.2.50, like that. If we don't place that correctly, that new rule, if we place it down here, the auto NAT is going to match on the source IP address and it's going to be padded over to .7. So one of the benefits of having this section above and section below is that we can add manual rules to the top that we want to take priority or precedence, in effect, have them work before they go to the auto section. So for this manual NAT demo, we'll go ahead and create a manual rule above the auto NAT, and then we'll take steps to verify that the correct translation took place. So based on our game plan, we're going to open up the Firepower Management Center and click on the Devices tab here at the top, and then from below that, we'll select NAT. Here's our NAT policy where we made the auto NAT in the previous nugget, and what we'll do is we'll go ahead and edit that to add a new rule with a manual NAT rule above the existing auto NAT rule. So we'll click on Edit. We'll click on Add Rule to add a new rule. We'll specify that we want a manual NAT rule. And we're going to put it in the category of NAT rules before, referring to before the auto NAT rules. And the type of NAT rule that we can create can be static or dynamic. So static is there, the translation's there, whether it's used or not. And the dynamic sits as a rule just sitting there in the policy until there's traffic that matches that rule. And at that moment, it creates the translation on the firewall. So let's go ahead and do a dynamic translation. And for the interface objects, we'll say if traffic is coming into the firewall on an interface associated with the inside zone, and that traffic is eventually going to be routed out an interface associated with the outside zone. And if we click on the translation tab to continue that logic, and if the original source is Lois's computer. Now, what we could do is if we have an object that's already created that represents Lois's computer, we could go ahead and use that. If this did not, oh, and that is the wrong address. So let's create a new object that represents that computer at .101. So we'll call this computer at 101, and we'll put in its IP address of 10.1.0.101 and click on Save. And then we'll choose that object, and there it is, computer at 101. So if the traffic is the source IP address of 10.1.0.101, which is being reflected here by the object called computer at 101, we want to translate that source address into a specific IP address of 23.1.2.50. So what we could do is if we have an object that reflects that, we could use the object, or we could create a new object that reflects the address that we want to translate her source address to. And we'll call that postNAT50, and then for the IP address, we'll put in 23.1.2.50 and click Save. And then we'll make sure we grab that from the pick list here, and there it is, postNAT50. And one other thing about manual NAT rules, whether we put them before or after the auto NAT, they give us more flexibility and more options in doing either source or destination address translation, depending on what we need to do for the NAT rule. In this case, we're just doing simple source address translation, so we're good to go. We'll go ahead and click on OK. We'll then click on Save to save that NAT policy, and then we have the final step of clicking on Deploy and making sure that our FTD1 is included in that list for the deployment, and then click on Deploy. And in just a few minutes, this firewall, FTD-1, will have that updated new NAT policy with the two rules. So let's check our status. We'll click on the status icon right here, and under tasks, it looks like it's done. And if we click on deployments, it looks like it's done. Fantastic. Let's go to the command line of the FTD appliance, and we'll verify that the NAT rules show up there as well. So we are currently logged on to the FTD appliance, and we'll do a show NAT, press enter, and that's going to show us the NAT rules, including the sections. So here's section 1 for the manual NAT before auto, and here's section 2 where we have our auto NAT rule. So here we have a little client on that inside network. If we do an if config, we can verify its IP address. So that's great news. We have the correct IP address on the inside network. So when this computer generates traffic that goes through the firewall, that should trigger on that first NAT rule. It should create a translation to the IP address of 23.1.2.50 before the firewall sends it out the outside interface. So let's do a trace route out to www.google.com. That'll generate some traffic for us. Let that go, and let's go back to the interface on the FTD, and let's do a show xlate and press enter. And sure enough, there's our translation. On the Linux box, when I do trace route, it uses UDP as part of that, and so it's translating the inside host of 10.1.0.101 with that port to the outside at 23.1.2.50 based on our rule, and that translation is currently in place. And if we issue the command show NAT and press enter, that's also going to reflect in the output that translation has been in use. So here's our translate hits right here, indicating it's being used. In this nugget, we did the planning for implementing a manual NAT rule. Once we had the plan in place, we implemented it, and then we verified it on the firewall itself. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.